My name is Teresa Lorenz. So I'm going to talk first about the natural history of the species and then go into a little bit of detail about what I did for my master's tracking Clark's nutcracker movements. And I actually have some connection to Twist because while I worked down in Yakima, we had our Yakima nutcrackers not twist. And we followed them, which is not all that easy. Well, a lot of people become familiar with Clark's nutcracker probably for worse by going to national parks like Crater Lake, Glacier, Rocky Mountain National Park, Mount Rainier, and nutcrackers quite readily become habituated to humans at these places, so they'll come with human handouts, and like this tourist is, I'm sure the nutcrackers appreciate it. But once you start getting more out in the natural world, you'll mostly just see nutcrackers associated with pines. Nutcrackers are unusual corvids. They straddle two worlds. So you'll hear that corvids are often called generalists. They use many different habitat types. They'll forage on pretty much anything they can get. So nutcrackers try to be generalists a lot of the time, but then the other half of the time, they are devoted to this evolutionary past tied with pines. Large seeded pines, and I'll probably use that term throughout this talk. Generally a pine, large seeded pine is anything bigger than that has a seed bigger than about a ponderosa pine seed. So they're small, but to the birds, they're relatively large.
Would the term stone pine also apply?
Yeah, stone pine. I'll talk about them a little more in detail. Stone pines are a common name for the subgenus, I believe, of pines that, of which whitebark pine is a member. They call them stone pines in the old world in Eurasia. So there's a Swiss stone pine, a Korean stone pine, a Japanese stone pine. Maybe you two know more. And then whitebark pine is a stone pine, but we don't call it.
Teresa, you said they like pines with seeds bigger than ponderosa?
Yes.
Pines, because they, ponderosa, a lot of
Like down to ponderosa pine is generally what people consider to be large seeded. I mean, it's just kind of a general term. People say large seeded, they usually don't mean something smaller than a ponderosa pine seed.
Okay.
Now, Clark's nutcrackers will eat Douglas fir seeds. I'll talk about that. They'll pretty much try to eat anything they can. So I've seen them on western white pine cones, which are very small seeds. They probably weren't getting much out of it, but. So these birds, yeah. Throughout the talk, I'll just kind of go back and forth between that. They're kind of tied to two worlds. This generalist side of them, in which they'll eat almost anything, like birds and feeders, carrion. They'll try and eat frogs, mammals, stuff like that. But then in autumn, they all try to find pine seed to eat, and then they store it for overwintering. So they're just kind of like balancing between these two halves of their evolutionary past. This is the Clark's nutcracker range. I'll show this map later on when I talk about large seeded pines in western North America, because this range pretty much overlaps the range of all large seeded pines in western North America. So up in here we have the sugar Jeffrey pines and whitebark pine. When we get into Washington, we have ponderosa pine and whitebark pine. Also they eat Douglas fir here. Up in here it's mostly ponderosa pine, and this part of the range is a little bit enlarged compared to reality. So mostly they're restricted to the mountain ranges where there's pine in Canada. Once you get down to here, they'll eat limber pine, which is similar to whitebark pine having large seeds, but they're not that closely related. Down in here, they'll eat Great Basin bristlecone, ponderosa pines, and then down in the southwest, they really like to eat pinyon pines.
Lodgepole,
Lodgepole have really small seeds, so they have been seen at lodgepole pine cones trying to get seeds up, but they're probably not succeeding. Presumably, as they travel, I'll talk about this later, as they travel, they're very wide-ranging birds. They'll move throughout their range. Individuals will move from Arizona up to British Columbia, down to Washington and such. As they move, they kind of encounter new cones for species they've never seen, and presumably they check it out. Maybe this will work, I don't know, is there a seed in there? So, like a lot of corvids, not like Steller's jays, but like things like pinyon jays, ravens will nest early also. They really nest in the late winter. So right about now they're getting started with their courtship, probably, for individuals that decide to breed. So it's cold and snowy. It doesn't really seem like a time, but I want to be nesting anyway. And we believe, anyway, that they're able to do this because they rely on their seed caches that they cache the previous fall. So they don't need there to be a flush of insects in order to initiate breeding. Now, once the nestlings get a little older, like into April, and start to get ready to fledge, then the birds will need insects to be starting to hatch out, we think. Now, I need to clarify, there's a lot of aspects of the species' natural history we don't know much about, so. People always want to ask me, what's the oldest white-headed woodpecker? What's the oldest Clark's nutcracker? So I put this slide in here at the last minute. So the longest lived nutcracker in the wild from banding data, it was 17 years old. And all we know is it was captured as an adult. 17 years later, it was resighted. So it could have been older than that, we don't know. And people are generally impressed at bird longevity, and they should be, because birds are really cool. Birds are like marvels, absolute marvels of nature. So we think they've evolved, birds in general have evolved to have like greater longevity than mammals because they were able to escape predators so much better that there was an evolutionary advantage to living long. Things like mammals, like you can't, like especially females can't reproduce after like age 40 or 50, so you might as well die, right? Because then you're like, very long So they have a Malaysian albatross that is reproducing a female at age 65. Yeah. And they have like kittiwakes in Ireland that are like 40 years old and are still reproducing just great. So presumably nutcrackers live a very long time. They have evolved a way to, I don't know how, but you should read this, go on Google. The birds have evolved a way to handle free radicals, so their cells aren't so damaged by the actions of free radicals in their blood. And presumably there was an evolutionary advantage to this. They weren't as prone to being depredated or killed as adults. So evolution gave them a better ability to live long. And birds have been studied for quite some time for helping with human longevity, like research on human longevity. So I put that picture of a chipmunk there. So these two species weigh about the same. Of course, the chipmunk is smaller because birds are lighter weight in general for the same body size. So for the same body size, a chipmunk even in captivity would live what, like 2 to 3 years? And in a wild nutcracker no, at least 17 years, probably quite a bit longer. So birds are cool. So the cool fact about Clark's nutcracker, they're the only bird species named after William Clark and the Lewis and Clark expedition. And some of you who know birds may be thinking, what about Clark's grebe? But Clark's grebe was named after a different Clark. So this is the only species with a common name named after this explorer. They were first seen, we think, by white men south of Missoula in the Bitterroot Valley, and Meriwether Lewis saw the first nutcracker and thought it was a woodpecker because of the bill. And then it was only on the way back from the Pacific, when Lewis and Clark were returning home, they had to stop at Weehite Prairie in Idaho to wait for the passings to clear, and they had apparently a lot of nutcrackers there. Probably there was a cone crop there at the time. This was like late winter. And William Clark saw the Clark's nutcracker and correctly identified it as a corvid. And so they named, presumably that's why they named the species then. So very basic plumage details. They're a gray bird, black and white wings and tail. So they're quite flashy when they fly. And I can start passing this guy around. One of his wings fell off, and so I'll pass that. And then the adults there have that. So the adults have this white face, which is fairly subtle, but juveniles don't. So if you see a bird like this, it's very similar to the adult. If you see it, they have slightly browner plumage, but you really can't see that unless you have a bird in the hand. So the juveniles lack this white face. I can go back to the previous slide. And then another difference between adults and juveniles, because they look pretty much the same otherwise, is the juveniles will have a pink mouth. And I tried to find a picture of a juvenile with its mouth open compared to an adult, and I couldn't. Adults have a black mouth, and the juveniles have a pink mouth. Otherwise, they look very similar. There's a couple look-alike species. So the northern shrike, which is a lot smaller, and I don't think you generally confuse it with the nutcracker unless you see it flashing through the sagebrush. You know, they have the same plumage characteristics, black and white wings and tail, the gray back and head, but of course the loggerhead shrike has the black through the eye, which a nutcracker doesn't. And they don't generally inhabit the same habitat types. So these guys tend to be in shrub steppe. Nutcrackers generally are, they need a tree usually. They'll pass over shrub steppe, so you might, you know, make a mistake sometimes, but northern shrikes are also quite a bit smaller in size. And then this is the species people tend to confuse nutcrackers with. This is a gray jay. People call it a camp robber, which is just a colloquial term. The official name is gray jay. You may know. Common names of birds are official. The American Ornithologists Union officially names birds. They have a single common name, and that's different from things like mammals and plants. There's no unifying body that determines the name of the gray wolf is the gray wolf. You call it a gray wolf, you call it a timber wolf, and you never. But birds are different. So this is a gray jay. It has a single common name. That's it. Common name is also another word for the English name.
Did everybody say?
So differences between the nutcracker and the gray jay in plumage. They just don't have that flashy wing, black and white wing and tail. It's just overall gray. They have that little funky little cap on their head. And then the bigger differences are things that, once you start knowing more about the Clark's nutcracker, are things like the bill. So the gray jay has a very stubby little bill. They're carrion eaters, and as far as we know, this species evolved to follow packs of vertebrate land mammals as they hunted. So it's no coincidence when you go out in the woods and these guys come up to you to get handouts. They evolved to follow things like wolves, probably humans and such, and then they eat the carrion after that those animals have made a kill. Clark's nutcrackers are different. They evolved with pines, so they have a very long bill compared to this guy. These guys are also very weak flyers, so they don't move around on the landscape like nutcrackers do. So there's been some recent genetic studies, which I find really interesting, maybe you wouldn't, that I've heard presented at some national ornithological conferences, looking at relatedness within populations. So this species is really genetically distinct. A population in Twisk, Washington is probably going to be very genetically different than a population in like Bend, Oregon. Whereas nutcrackers are just this mishmash. So you have nutcracker, there's like no genetic differentiation among nutcrackers. A bird in Nevada could be related to a bird in British Columbia, things like that. And we'll talk about that.
Teresa, I'm looking at this bird and your other bird over there. There's not very much white on the face, but there's a little tiny bit.
That guy's old.
Oh,
He's been sitting in the room in
Over
Logan,
17.
Utah.
I see.
Turned gray.
So the white is turned gray. Okay, thank you.
I can pass this guy around with you. Please be very careful. I did mean to. So this guy was professionally done. He sits at the Natchez Ranger District office. The head wobbles, so I was driving and the head was jiggling back and forth. Just be careful. You might not want to touch it in case something happens. But the biggest difference between nutcrackers and the gray jay is not visible. It's in their head mostly. So nutcrackers have a very large brain and hippocampus, which is a portion of the brain that relates to memory. So Clark's nutcrackers have the best spatial memory of any animal in the world, and this makes them absolutely distinctive.
Can you guys pick your stuff up off this? Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry we're late.
Sorry to disrupt him.
So nutcrackers are have the best spatial memory, better than any human, I am sure. So every year, a Clark's Nutcracker will store an estimated 50 to 80,000 individual seeds in little caches. That's estimated, yes. It's based on the rate at which the birds will harvest seeds from the trees and then the number of trips they'll take to the ground to any given location.
Is it 50 to 80,000?
Yes, 50000. So there have been these guys have been the subject of a large number of laboratory studies. So you're probably wondering where the heck this picture was taken. So this bird is standing on an ice cube tray filled with sand and a little cage. I'm not even sure where this was. This may be from England, because there's a research group actually in that Audubon magazine that works out of Oxford with these guys. So this is a seed of some kind. I don't know what it is, and there's a seed down there. And they'll put the birds in like a lab. They'll deprive them of food so that they're induced to cache. So they'll deprive them for food for like half a day, and let them out into this aviary, and the birds will cache, and then they'll do all sorts of experiments with them, like wait 10 days and see if they can find the caches. And one of the early studies waited 285 days. So there's a situation like this, you know, these ice cube trays. I mean, I couldn't remember where I put the seed if it were me. And they let the birds back in the room, and they go straight to the cube where they had placed the seeds 285 days prior. Now, we don't know much about what they do in the wild. We presume that they will remember all of their seeds. We don't really know. Clearly, they remember many, or some, based on these laboratory studies. Oh, and there's a little schematic I found online. I should have put the credit. I didn't draw this. I don't have any artistic ability. So this shows kind of it's hard to get photos of all these things out in the wild, so that's why I chose the schematic. So they'll harvest seeds in autumn, fly off to cache sites, and then plant them in the ground. And now, I told you I did my master's thesis with these guys, and it was the first telemetry study. One of the main things I was interested in doing was looking at just how they moved across the landscape. What's the home range size? That's an important metric in learning about wildlife. Like, what kind of area does an individual need? So that was the main reason that I radio tagged them. And then I was out there in autumn and just started seeing the craziest things going on. So I ended up doing a whole other chapter of my thesis on their caching behavior. Because one thing that people didn't realize, they'll cache on the ground, and it's really easy to see them caching on the ground. You walk through the woods and you're like, oh, there's a nutcracker on the ground. It turns out they cache, in the Cascades anyway, more than half their seeds in the trees. And people never saw it, so nobody knew about it. So they'll get the seeds out of the cones, fly to a different tree, and just cache it like in little clumps of lichen, like where a branch will come, you know, like the little fork in a branch, they'll stuff it in there. So that was a really cool find. The first time I saw it, I was like, what's the bird doing? And then it's like, oh my gosh, they were doing it all the time.
So do they stay within the kind of general area where they cache?
Yeah, that was another thing we found. No.
Because I thought maybe that's how they figured out where their things were.
I was going to talk about this later, but I can talk about it now. So we tracked them when they were at a tree and then when they flew off to a cache site. And it turns out they will fly up to 32.6 kilometers to cache seeds. I don't know if anyone can convert that to miles. About 20. So they also can carry up to 20% of their body weight in seeds. So they are marvels. They're really strong flyers. I said that gray jays were weak flyers. I didn't comment. Nutcrackers are really strong flyers. They have very long wings and a short tail, and they're really, so they can fly 45 miles an hour, and then their ability to turn and do maneuvers in the air is similar to ravens. You see ravens like doing cartwheels and such. So I've seen them out in the field, even a bird wearing a transmitter, and a sharp-shinned hawk came up. It was a juvenile sharp-shinned hawk on migration, and it came up to my bird, and I was like, oh my gosh, my bird's gonna die. And the nutcracker just like flew up around the tree and started chasing the sharp-shinned hawk.
Oh, God, serious.
Yeah. And then it actually, they started kind of like twisting through the air and doing cartwheels and such around this Whitebark I did once, I had a female nutcracker radio tag and a merlin came out of nowhere, and she didn't play around with that. She dove into the tree. So I guess they know the difference between a sharpshin hawk and a merlin. Anyhow, so they will, now they do that long distance caching because so this is more detail it's going to get into, but they have two different life strategies. So they want to be residents in one area and never leave. That is preferred. But sometimes if cones aren't available in a given location, they will have to leave. And then they'll take up this migratory strategy where they might move all over the west, for example. They might go down to Nevada or something to find cones. Anyway, if they have this resident strategy, then they have a lot of incentive to cache seeds in their little home range where they intend to breed the next year, because then they have all their seeds right at home. So they're planning for the future. They're like thinking out, well, I want to breed here, so I'll go out and find seeds and bring them back here. So they'll go out in like 20 miles in every direction searching for seeds and trying to bring as many of them home to their home territory as possible. So that's what you will see them doing, this long distance caching. But then if they have had to leave their home and they're in this migratory phase of their life, then they don't have that incentive to cache seeds long distances, and so they might just harvest seeds in the tree and then drop them to the ground and cache them there.
So how many can they carry at one time if they're flying so many miles?
So it's about 80 Whitebark pine seeds, I believe. I'm a little rusty on them. It's 20% of their body weight. Yeah, I think into that next slide.
You mentioned that one bird you're afraid it was going to get caught by the hawk.
Yeah.
Was a she?
The first one was a male. Actually, those two were mated.
How do you tell the difference?
You can't.
So how did you know from watching them at the nest?
Weight. So there are slight differences in body weight. There's a lot of overlap, but for that particular pair, also because they mated and I saw them mating.
But you didn't know. Oh, I see. So the male's on top or something.
Okay.
I laugh, but that's what they did.
Nothing to laugh about.
One of the basic parameters that we as biologists study.
Millions shot.
So I think one time we saw them caching them seeds. They had full crops. You could see them flying with these giant crops.
Yeah.
And it was
So they
they
do
look
this.
like pelicans flying.
Yeah.
So this is a schematic too. They're like, it's like a chipmunk's cheek pouches, but it's in the throat region, and so they can stuff them down in there, and then they look absolutely ridiculous. That's a picture from our study area. It's this huge thing, and when they take off and fly through the air, it looks like they have two heads almost.
You can tell they're full when their heads are tipped back and they're flying. When they fly with that thing if they're full, tips their head back.
I don't know. I haven't noticed that so much, but I see the big bulge that just distracts me.
So
We
we saw
watched
them.
them do that at Hawk Watch up on
Yeah.
the hill. And they would fly one way empty.
Yeah,
and
and
when
then they go
came
back.
their head still at their back.
Yeah.
But we
There.
saw them and it looked like they were catching them in the side of a peak
Okay.
in the mountainside.
Was it like a rocky slope?
It was a sheer.
Yeah.
You know, and so no one else would ever be able to get the seeds out of there. It seemed like, but it was pretty smart. And then they were doing these amazing aerial flights, and there was a lot of them going there. It was pretty cool. Full of seeds. So they cached it. It looked like they cached them in the mountain.
Their caching behavior is extremely complicated. Yes, they will cache on steep talus slopes. I presume this was kind of talusy. Maybe. I mean, they would have to get it into rock somehow.
Yeah, it was rocky, sheer, in a major mountain. Sorry.
So if you have a bird that's a resident and it needs to retrieve its seed caches, probably mostly in winter, you have to find a place that's not going to be under snow in winter. So caching in the forest canopy is a great idea. So they put about half their seeds there, and then they would cache seeds in the steep slopes. If they can, south-facing, because that melts out. Otherwise, if it's wind-swept, that's probably preferred as well. And then we would have them carrying them down into the Ponderosa pine zone, whitebark pine seeds. So whitebark pine is a really high elevation species. Steal their talk. And Ponderosa pine is really low, but they like both those. They like eating both those seeds. So they'll be up in the whitebark pine zone and then carry their seeds down low, like to the Twisp area, you know, this elevation, where there's not nearly as much snow. They have a whole slew of different strategies. We really don't understand their caching behavior very well. We just have this rudimentary understanding of what's going on out there. So, Clark's nutcrackers' closest living relatives are both back in the old world, probably like a lot of us here today. So they superficially resemble things like pinyon jays, which harvest pinyon pines in the desert southwest. But that is a result of what we call convergent evolution. Two species evolved similar ways of doing the same thing, but they're not closely related. So, as far as we know, the ancestral nutcracker carried stone pine seeds from Eurasia over the Bering Land Bridge, and it's about 100 million years ago, I think, and then down into the New World. I like this slide. So if you want to see the closest living relatives, you go to places like the Alps in Italy. There's a castle there. And there's a relative of whitebark pine there. That's a Swiss stone pine. And they look just the same. They got 5 needles and everything, and the same type seeds. And then, that's a spotted nutcracker. I've been to Europe, and I've never seen one, and I really want to. So they sound like Clark's nutcrackers, and if you just ignore the white spots on the brown body, they look alike. So they got the white butt there, just like Clark's. They got black and white wings and tail and that big beak. They're the same breeding strategy, the same caching strategy, everything. Just like this mirror image of our Clark's nutcracker. So once Clark's nutcrackers got over the Bering Land Bridge, presumably there was some reason that they just evolved, changed their plumage, and then they moved into these other areas where the stone pines didn't exist, the whitebark pine didn't exist, because in the New World, at the same time, whitebark pine was or the stone pines were evolving with Clark's nutcracker, or the spotted nutcracker. You had in the New World the same thing playing out, but with a different set of species. So in the desert southwest, you had scrub jays and pinyon jays caching seeds for the liver pine, Great Basin bristlecone pine, things like sugar pine, and the pinyon pines, most importantly. And so these species evolved with the New World pines that evolved large seeds. The nutcrackers evolved with the Old World pines that evolved large seeds, but for whatever reason, probably because the nutcrackers are such strong flyers, they made it over the Bering Land Bridge, but the pinyon jays didn't go the opposite way. So once nutcrackers got here, they're like, oh my gosh, look at all these cool pines, and they spread all over the West to take advantage of these things. So, I've been talking so much about pines. Yes.
Sorry, looks like you're moving into something else, but, so is there competition in those areas between the Clark's nutcracker and the guys who are already there?
Yep.
And do they win? I mean, has anybody studied that?
I'm a little rusty on that, those research papers. I would think Clark's nutcracker are probably dominant because they're faster flyers, heavier, bigger birds, but there's probably a lot of I would think there's some give and take.
And it would depend on how abundant the seeds are, how much competition there would be.
Yeah.
And how many birds and all that, but I'm just wondering, because you said they moved in on them, and often you have some story with that of, some bird is declining because another one moved in.
Probably, it was just so long ago, we don't know.
Yeah.
And now their ranges overlap.
But that's it, I mean, the ranges overlap, so is there still competition if the ranges overlap?
Almost certainly there would be.
And we don't know how that's affecting various different species.
No. Very good question, though. It'd be a great thing to study if we could get a time machine. So, I've been talking so much about their specialist half of Clark's nutcracker, now their generalist half. So, they will forage on pine seeds whenever available. They will just go to pine seeds. But pines evolved to have this cycle of reproduction called masting, where they will produce a large cone crop in one year and then generally have several years of low cone production. in those off years, nutcrackers have to figure out what to do. Now they sometimes will move across their range, like I was saying, they move all throughout their range. And other times they will just forage on other things that may be available. So there's some older research papers talking about them eating frogs, lizards, catching, that's a gray crown, that's a rosy finch, I'm not sure if it's a gray crown. Is it a gray crown?
Looks like it.
So anyway, there's a research paper about them hawking finches out of the air. So they're very capable if they must be. And then they're well known as nest predators also. So they will eat songbird eggs whenever they can find them. And then in summertime, they will forage almost exclusively on what arthropods they can find and in whatever form they can. And so for my particular research, we found they would focus on carpenter ants early on in the summer. You'll have these flushes of carpenter ants, maybe like May or so. They really dig spruce budworm. You guys know what spruce budworm is?
Yeah.
So let's go through the Cascades, and the nutcrackers totally honed in on that, although if that's dying off, I don't know what they're going to do in the meantime. And then in late summer, we see them doing things like this, catching grasshoppers out in these high elevation meadows. You think those grasshoppers that go out and sound like the sprinklers? And then when the bugs start drying up, most of the neotropical migrants start moving out, and that's when things like nutcrackers key in on seeds. And I imagine there's probably hormones in there because they just revert to seeds. They're all about seeds. They just find whatever seeds they can and just load up, trip after trip after trip. If they can, they will harvest seeds from July through December and be making trips with their pouches daily as much as possible. And you can imagine if they're like stocking up for winter, you want to be sure, there's no point in taking a risk. If, you might as well store as many seeds as you possibly can.
Do they take another, if they find another bird's cache, will they take it? Or do they interlope that way?
Yeah. Now, the correct answer is we don't really know. They will cache in large groups together, side by side in some cases, so we have nutcracker cache in there, nutcracker cache in there, and they don't steal each other's caches. Now, most of the time when humans have been watching this behavior, it's autumn and cones and seeds are super abundant. So I would imagine a bird's caching, and there's like no profit in trying to beat up that guy to get his caches. You might as well just cache your own and go back to the stand where you have free seeds everywhere. It might be different in like winter, when food is scarce and you don't have a resource of food readily available. We don't know though. They do steal each other's caches. So I already touched on this. One advantage that they do have if they have multiple seed sources in one region is they can switch between seed sources. So here in the Cascades, they'll often start out on whitebark pine, which has the largest seeds. And also, I believe it even ripens earlier than other species. I might be wrong there. It definitely has the largest seeds, so presumably they're the most valuable. Once that cone crop has been harvested, they'll move down to ponderosa pine, which has the next largest seeds, and then they'll move on to Douglas fir if it's available. So you can imagine if whitebark pine has a bumper crop, but ponderosa pine completely fails, well then they'll just go from whitebark pine to Douglas fir. If whitebark pine fails, then they'll start at ponderosa pine and go to Douglas fir. There's a lot of places in the Rockies where you might only have whitebark pine, you might only have Douglas fir, or something like that. Depending on the availability of seeds within a certain area, they might either just emigrate and leave the region, or they might harvest seeds for a short period of time and then leave the region. We don't know a lot about their migration patterns except they move a lot. So people have been describing to me that you've been seeing a lot of nutcrackers here, especially in the early part of the winter. Nobody could tell you where those birds came from or why they were there. There was probably a cone failure somewhere in the Intermountain West from where that population came from. This large flock, it's all right, where the birds that are coming to your feeders came from. and we don't know where they would have come from. They came here, they probably found some food. People have asked if it was related to the fire. I tend to doubt it.
You'd think the fire would have caused immigration instead of immigration.
Yeah, it's just so impossible to predict because they're tracking these cones. And it's just, they're tracking these cones across such a large region. So, you might have the same cone crop in Twist, Washington 2 years in a row, the exact same cone crop. But perhaps in 1 year you had a bumper crop in British Columbia, but the next year there's no cones in British Columbia. So that will cause those birds in 1 year to remain up there and then the next year to come down here. So even if you have the same cone crop in the same location year after year after year, it still doesn't, the nutcrackers could be responding to something distant, coming from another area. Does that make sense? So, if anybody says they know where these nutcrackers are coming from and why they're here, they don't know. We just don't know yet.
Build a wall.
So you'll...
What do you think? Build a wall.
So you'll read in guidebooks, like Sibley, Guide to Birds, that I think it says in there that these are residents of montane forest. People call nutcrackers residents, and they're not. They're not. They're really migratory. So ornithologists call them facultative partial migrants. So facultative means that they migrate when they have to relative to cones, and partial in that they will move partially within a range. So they don't all pick up and go to like Costa Rica. That would be a complete migration. Instead it's partial. Like a population might move here, another one might move there. And the reason people don't think about them as migratory is because they never just completely leave for like consistently every winter. The yellow rumple warblers will leave, and then they'll come back. And people are like, oh, they're migratory. But with nutcrackers, you'll often see them in winters, you'll often see them in summers. Sometimes you don't, but often you do. And so people just call them resident. But nutcrackers are the furthest thing from resident. They are one of the most global species out there. In fact, well,
But then it's interesting they're caching seeds in place to come back to.
yes.
And
I have a theory about that I never published because I don't have data on it. It's just a theory, really.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah. So if you have a bird that has to move from an area, there's a ton of seed. Okay, so you're on the move, coming say out of British Columbia, heading to California, and you stop in Washington, and there happen to be cones. Well, if there's a bumper crop, you might as well cache. It's so little. There's so little energy required. So you have just tons of food everywhere. Like, well, start caching. And then maybe if you realize you've been caching, well, gosh, I've been caching for like 8 weeks, or I might as well stay. And then they'll stay. But, okay, they start caching, it's like, oh, it's only 3 weeks worth of seed caches. Well, I better keep going to California, and they'll think that. Then on the return trip, and this is what I would see in that sheet. So in springtime, you'll have nutcrackers again on the move. I think about it in terms of north-south, but they probably aren't always moving north-south. They move east-west. They'll move north in fall, sometimes south in spring. But anyway, they're on the move again in springtime. They move as a flock. They're a lot like humans, so they don't necessarily think about the ground so much as being important as the unit that they are with. So they can travel throughout a large region as long as they're with the flock and be happy and comfortable, like us. And this is important, because if you're with a flock that happen to have cached, like up, I don't know, up in Twist, somewhere on a mountain here, the flock will go to an area where they had cached, and if there was a large number of caches placed there, those seeds will start sprouting through the ground, and the nutcrackers will start picking off the seedlings as they sprout. So you move with this flock, sharing this communal information as you move about the landscape. So you could have cached in Twist, and you might come back here in springtime, then next spring. You may have never been to Twist in your life, but you catch up with the flock that's going through Twist, and then some of those individuals know where the food is, and they will take you to that food. It's not simple. These are not simple birds.
Kind of altitudinal migration and all that?
Altitudinal migration. I just wouldn't describe it that way. They will move up and down in elevation, but they will do it very often, so it's not seasonal. I guess when people say migration, most people tend to think like seasonal. instead, they're just always on the move and it's hard to predict. Depends on food. How am I doing on time? Trying to hurry up.
It's 6:55.
Okay, hurry up. So I just put this back in here because I was going to talk about, we call them migrants, but most people don't think about them as the migrants because they're almost always moving around within their range. Because they're like, British Columbia birds might go to California if they don't have cones up here, or they might come down here. But so there is migration within the range, but people don't notice it because there's usually nutcrackers at some point in time at all these locations. And then, very briefly, we will do these, what we call extraliminal movements. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with this term. Things like snowy owls will do this and show up in weird places. So nutcrackers have been sighted in places like Ontario, Michigan, Indiana. And then there's this really cool thing. So nowadays, when people publish research papers, you have to do like all this modeling and talk about habitat usage. It's really boring. You go back to the papers from like the 1890s, and they would report all sorts of cool things. It's like a nutcracker showed up in Indiana. I was like, that's cool. I mean, I do that. And then someone reported a nutcracker on a boat. Someone was out going to like the Santa Catalina Islands, I think it is, off the coast of California, and they had a nutcracker land on their boat. And it's published. You would never do that now. And then with this slide, I wanted to talk about the importance of the flock. So they're not so much territorial. They're not like a junco. Like a junco will be born here, just right outside here. And it'll go south to Arizona in winter, and it'll come back here, that same junco, and nest again. And they're really tied to these patches of ground. They have really strong site fidelity, we call it. Things like nutcrackers have fidelity to their flock, just like humans. So you can go to Spain and be really happy and enjoy yourself. Nutcrackers can go to Nevada, and they're, as long as they're there. As long as there's nutcrackers there, they're happy. I brought this stuff to show you some of the equipment we work with, but no, go ahead. I go, yeah. Okay, you can do it.
Should we turn on, can you turn on the light behind you, then the one
Oh,
down?
I moved around. So I'm not going to get into the detail of the whitebark pine and its decline. I will just say that one of the main food sources for this species is in decline, and so that prompted the research study that funded my master's, where we looked at Clark's nutcracker movements, as I said. We used radiotelemetry, and how many people have used radiotelemetry? Yeah. Okay, so I brought some stuff. I think this stuff is really interesting. Maybe you will too. So I brought some of the transmitters we use on these birds. I'm going to pass them around.
How much does one of those cost?
Yeah. Oh, cost. I'm trying to say weight. It depends. Those ones are 150. We make really cool programmable ones now that we use on our whiteheads that are 225.
Still pretty
Satellite ones are like $1,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, what portion of the bird's weight? So those are 3% of the body weight, which is generally the cutoff that the bird banding lab allows you for putting tags on birds. They will allow you to use 5% of the body weight if you have a really good reason, but 3% is generally the acceptable limit. So as you pass that around, look at the size of those openings. So the antenna sticks out over the back of the bird. It would come out like this. The wings go through 2 of the larger holes, and then the head goes through the smallest hole in the front. And look at that hole as it comes around. It is tiny. So those are pre-fitted to the birds. It comes all, actually, I make the harness, but then it's all loose, and you slip the wings through and then tighten it down. And that just always amazes me. They are so much bigger than they look because they're so feathery and puffed
When
up.
you get that over his head, doesn't it keep him from getting so full of seed that his...
We didn't see any effect. We didn't see any effect.
So they
It
still have
actually
big
comes
fat,
over.
they still have big fat pouches with that thing on.
It doesn't. It looks like it goes around the neck, but it actually sits quite a bit further on the bird. So the patch goes right over the keel. We would align it with the keel bone. So and then one strap would come over the wing like that.
Do you think it affected the survival?
Yeah, great question. So that type harness design is known to impact spotted owl survival negatively. We didn't know, but no one's ever studied the species.
You never found something, you never observed.
We would have deaths, usually a pile of feathers. There wasn't any obvious reason to think that it caused mortality, but if I had to do it again, I'd use what we use on woodpeckers, which is the leg loop harness. It's a lot. That's the thing. So I brought a functioning transmitter because that one is dead. So this is one of our white-headed transmitters, white-headed woodpecker. And this just goes around the, loops around the legs.
We'll put it on Melody and set her outside.
I'm sorry, my light's too big. Won't work.
So you put that on the bird, and then it operates by emitting a beep. So that thing's beeping. If you had a radio tuned to the frequency, 165.121. And then you have a directional antenna, and I meant to bring it. I thought I had one. So I didn't bring the antenna. And you point the antenna at where the signal is, and then you can home into the bird. You listen to wherever the signal is loudest. And Ken would know that it sounds simple, but it is wicked hard. So, we'll go around and listen to this one now. And you get really sick of it. So that's that transmitter beeping, that white-headed woodpecker.
So did you use these to find the image of the bird on the nest, or?
Yeah, exactly.
That's what you were doing, like home ranges or?
Yes, oh no, we were doing it. So we would use that to find the bird. Those transmitters on the Nutcrackers lasted for about 1.25 years. And we would just track them usually once a week. If they nested, we would go to the nest. Now Nutcrackers, because of their reliance on seeds, don't nest every year. They will only nest if there's a really good comb crop and they go out to be stored up. So only a small proportion of our birds ever nested. But if we would go to the nest and measure things like home range size, how much that use, and so forth. And I should probably stuff.
What size is their nest?
How big is their nest? Yeah, it's pretty big and bulky, like a normal corvid. Corvid nests tend to be really big, bulky, big sticks.
And are they usually in the whitebark pine or the ponderosa pine? Or
it will be where they have seeds cached. It's actually in Yakima area, more commonly in the ponderosa pine zone. Nutcrackers are more abundant. It depends. It's really variable. They will. So if it's like they leave the Washington area to go to, say, the Great Basin because seeds, they're following the seed source, they will nest in the Great Basin when they get down there. So that explains their genetic mixing. So they will breed with populations as they travel, if they happen to be during the breeding season in a place with a good comb crop.
So it's pretty much wherever they are whenever the breeding season comes along is where they nest.
Yep.
They build their nest every year.
Are the pairs monogamous? Or is
We
it
don't know.
You don't know who if they're dominant birds in the group? Do they get the nest and the others don't?
We don't know. I kind of doubt it. I think it's just related to who can find food.
Do they nest more than once in the season?
No. Yeah. If they can't do it early on, then that's it. And that's actually an excellent question, because the pinion jay, the New World counterpart to the nutcracker, can breed in fall if there's a large comb crop. But the nutcracker cannot. Yeah.
We've seen the nutcrackers go at one another at the feeder, and I'm top.
Yeah.
One of them's basically that. Others will come and try and knock him off, and it's a churn there.
Yeah.
And then occasionally they'll get up and on their feet to feet
Really?
in the air.
Wow.
It's kind of fun to watch them. Really go. Feathers fly
No
occasionally.
kidding. Wow.
So they feed their young bugs? Or?
We think early on it's mostly seeds and then it turns to bugs, but it probably depends on the relative availability of those two
They
things.
do feed the chicks.
Seeds, we think.
Because they're born, if they're nesting so early,
Yeah.
when are their first chicks born?
Yeah, we mean like hatch?
Yeah.
It'd be like mid-March.
So
When-
they're feeding, so that they
Could be
not
some
only have
bugs,
to
but
have food for themselves, they'd have to have food for their young.
Yes, they would need to catch these for their young as well.
So what's the farthest sort of travel that you were able to document with these transmitters?
For individuals,
Yeah.
well, that bird kept going. The one that came up from Yakima, that was a female. She went up to Stehekin area. I think the Yeah, it was by that, it's out of Holden, there was a fire donkey.
Yeah.
She went into there, and we just couldn't fly, and they were just, so in order to do a scientific study, you need a sample size, you need to be like on top of the animal. If you have gaps in your data, well, you can't publish it. So it got to the point, she went into the fire, we couldn't track her for like a month, and I was like, she's out of the sample, sorry.
So Teresa, what was that distance? You had some birds that were on like ridges nesting here, and then they were flying to cache. Was it like 20 miles or routinely back and forth?
Clement.
They were going from, how far was that?
That was the furthest, that's 32.6 kilometers, they would go to like Mount Aix.
Like back and forth?
Yes, and that was, no one had known that Nutcrackers will cache this far, and I was tracking on this mountain outside of Yakima that's very dry. It's very, very dry. It's like Ponderosa pine. And this bird would vanish. This is the first year of the study. I had no idea what was going on. This bird would just vanish starting around Labor Day or a couple weeks before for hours at a time. I had no idea where the thing went. And then I happened to be out at Timberwolf at this mountain. It's maybe more like Tyee. It's high elevation whitebark pine. I was just out there dinking around with the radio receiver one day and found the bird. So you can see Clement Mountain, where the bird came from, and you can see the far mountains out there. I'm standing in the middle, and I was just playing around. I was like, oh, I hear the bird. What's going on? Where is he? And he was in that direction. His home is in that direction. This is actually Labor Day. I get my Forest Service Durango. I jump in the car, and I hit the gas. I'm like, the bird's going back and forth from Clement, like 30 kilometers. We got to Clement, and I was like, the bird showed up, and it was this epiphany, like, I just discovered this. Going back. But no, I had to be sure. So the sun is setting, the bird takes off back towards the mountains, and I hit the gas going up 410, and I got pulled over by a cop.
You talking about
you can't fly as fast as the birds, so slow down.
Ham, and I'm sort of a presentation crasher. But I've got a legit claim this time because Teresa's an old friend, and years ago when I had this old job, blah, 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 I met this young, enthusiastic, amazing researcher who showed up out of nowhere in Yakima, like, do you know where I might be able to find some Clark's Nutcrackers? And so, remember that? We were like, and she's like, we just went to the field like 2 times, just kind of, because I knew my way around the mountains a little bit, and helped her get her first, taste of that region. And then I find out years later, this same person has become the expert on Clark's Nutcrackers, who did this incredible, amazing stuff. So if you ever have occasion to blunder into somebody who is a wide-eyed, fanatical science type, there she is right there. So anyway, it was pretty cool. So Teresa, I saw Teresa at a science meeting not long ago, and she goes, hey, I'm coming up to Twist to give a talk. Do you want to come, quote, liven things up? And I said, I've been working on a Raven song, which I have for about 3 months. And she goes, well, come play it. Oh, okay, so what an opening is that? And in the meantime, coming back from the loop 2 weeks ago, that's only the second road-killed raven I've ever seen. And have anybody ever seen a road-killed raven? No. Exactly. They don't get put on the road. I'm going up there to go skiing. It's like, shit, check it out. So pulled over, picked it up, and so this bird is going to go to the interpretive center. So Paul Macro and the group said they've got a collection permit. So they're going to take it. Can you take it from here? Or I can get it to you. Is anybody on the interpretive center board here? Okay, I'll get it to them, but they're going to do something with it. And so, and it is pretty amazing. And Mary, you pointed that out. The size of that beak is absolutely incredible. And so I think, at a certain level, we're going to sort of honor this bird as I attempt to do this song, which isn't very long, you'll be blessed to know. And so we'll see if I do it justice. And so, maybe afterwards, if you have any suggestions about what to include, let me know. So, Frank, you're going to do me a sound check. Is that okay? That volume's okay? sit down because I can't see this otherwise, and I don't know the words yet. Okay. Black as the night, I fly high in the sky. I soar with the eagles, sun in my eye. Oh, I am the raven, I'm higher than you. I do tricks in the clouds, tips barrel rolls. I sing in the wind, I croak, I quack, I count a roll. I am the raven, sing better than you. Gorgeous black feathers, they shine in the light. I'm the pinnacle of creation. Oh, God got it right. I am the raven, I'm better than you. Dark, powerful beak, I crush eggshells and bone. I fly my trails each day, I find kills by your road. I am the raven, I watch over you. I am the raven, I'm smarter than you. Hyda, Macaw, and Twinklet saw me as a god. I hatched people from clamshells, now I sit atop the totem pole. Black as the night, I watch from above. I admire your tricks, but you really ain't so wise. I am the raven, I'm smarter than you. I shine in the sun, I fly high in the sky. I soar like an eagle, oh, my people will never die. Oh, I am the raven, I know what to do. I am the raven, I'm smarter than you. I am the raven, I will outlast you. That's what you call a final draft. So, because today I was sitting there writing out the lyrics. So there you go. So I'm thinking the title is Smarter Than You.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Stay tuned.
All right.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. Awesome.
Okay. And now we have Eireann Pederson, who's come up from Chelan in the Ranger District to talk with us about Clark's best friend.
This is a real tough act to follow.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm all for crashing presentations. So, I'm Eireann Pederson. I am the Chelan-Iniac District Forester. Kind of give you a little bit of my brief background. I've been working for the Forest Service now for just over 10 years, mostly in Chelan. I grew up there, so it's home for me. So this is kind of my backwoods forest. And I have been privileged to work with Whitebark pine for several years now. In fact, some of the expertise is sitting here with Teresa and Connie Mamo. So I learned from them, so if you have any feedback, I blame them. Teresa was the Whitebark supervisor for our forest, and after she retired, she kind of passed off the information to me. So I've been trying to wrangle in the forest and get things organized and stay proactive with whitebark pine restoration. So is there a clicker or just go through? So whitebark pine, how many of you are familiar with whitebark pine? Awesome. We can all go home. Yeah. So I'm going to just kind of touch on some of the key points with whitebark pine and the relationship with the Clark's Nutcracker. I'm also going to talk about the threats to whitebark pine and then what we're doing here currently on the Okanagan-Wenatchee forest to keep it from being completely listed as endangered. So as you can see, some of its things that make it up to be a foundation species and a keystone species is it promotes biodiversity. It's an early colonizer after disturbances. As Teresa was talking about, it's a very important food source for not only Clark's Nutcracker but grizzly bears, squirrels, a lot of species that rely on high elevation habitats. And then, for us, it helps regulate snowmelt and snowpack. So it's kind of the top of the pyramid when you're looking at high elevation ecosystems. So whitebark pine was first described in 1863, but yet things weren't really starting to come about until the 90s, based off of its history. As was talked about earlier, it is the only stone pine in North America. And is everybody familiar what a stone pine is? No. So it has to do with being a really tight, closed cone. There's also some other characteristics. So here's, just pass these around while we talk about some of this stuff. So in here you've got whitebark pine seeds. You can actually see the seed itself. It is one of the highest fat contents, has one of the highest fat contents of any of the conifer seeds, and that's why it's one of the main food sources. So you guys can take a look at some of those. And then whitebark pine cones. So these ones are kind of dried out, so they've lost their purple color. But you can see how tightly packed this is, and you can see the attributes of the Clark's Nutcracker and how important their beak is in prying these cones open to get the seeds. And you'll see that with some of these that have been annihilated. So, and then also here's one that I cut in half to check the seed quality when we were doing a cone collection, to look at the embryos and the seed development, to just kind of check maturity and what have you. So you can also see some of the deformities of cones and how things kind of are created in the natural world. They're not all picture perfect. So you can pass those around.
Can you describe what the stone pine is?
Yeah, so it's a closed cone. It has a wingless seed, so it's not like your ponderosa pine that opens and the seeds disperse. It also has to do with a 5-needle fascicle, which I've got some pictures of that as well.
So it's really descriptive characters, not
Yes.
a taxonomy.
Yes. And you two correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Whitebark pine is the 11th longest tree species. The oldest one to date is 1,270 years old. So you can imagine that lifespan. There's documentation of one of them being 9 feet in diameter, and in this picture you can start to see some of the clump gap or the clumping patterns in which these trees are grown in. As I mentioned, it was a high elevation 5-needle pine. It's found at or near timberline at about 6,000 feet and above is where its happy habitat is what I call it. We've been, on this forest alone, we have found whitebark pines all the way down to elevations of 3,000 feet. And that goes and ties in with the Clark's caching record. So they find a place down lower that they cache seeds, and some of those seeds will germinate. So the one thing that whitebark pine is reliant upon is
the Clark's Nutcracker to forget its seed caches, which is, it does happen, and that's where these clumped trees start to form. It's also, so this goes back into the 5 needles, you can see there. So that's a single stem up in your guys' area, the Pederson. And if you, something I should have done and what I wanted to show is you can see, so this is the current whitebark pine distribution of its habitat. And I was, Teresa's map almost lines up perfectly with this. So the relationship is starting to become clear on Clark's Nutcracker and whitebark pine. And this I just wanted to point out, since this is all home for us, currently on our forest we have about 585,000 acres of whitebark pine habitat. And 76% of that is in wilderness. So management actions are really, we don't do management in wilderness. So just leave it at that. So it gives us a small area to do restoration treatment. But hopefully we can work with some of the groups that are involved with wilderness to start to do some type of planting and restoration work on a light-handed situation. So whitebark pine environments, as I stated, high elevation, you've got your harsh cold sites, heavy winds, short growing seasons, small precipitation, really harsh environments, and it's one of the only tree species that's been known to basically colonize at elevations of this. So once again, temperatures, short growing season, you've got a lot of snowpack up there. It gives you kind of the definitions of how these trees are formed. They can grow in single stems in really open areas, or they can grow in a clumped pattern like you see down here in the right-hand corner, or they can grow into a crumble shape. So once again, high elevation, you've got a tree that's spreading out, you got lots of snowpack up there, really harsh conditions, and it's pretty interesting to see some of the shapes of these trees. If you Google whitebark pine images, they have these images of these beautiful trees that they've then put like a picture of a lady, and it's really interesting. So there's definitely a unique beauty in how these trees are formed. So as you guys have been talking about corvids, and for the past couple of weeks, I'll be honest with you, I'm a tree hugger. I do not know much about birds except for some of their relationships. But they are basically mutualistic together. So one thing about whitebark pine cones is that it takes 20 to 30 years to start producing trees. So, or producing seeds, excuse me, in cones. And then on top of that, you may have a 20, 30-year-old tree that's, waist high, and it can produce one cone, and it'll take up to 60 to 80 years to really produce a large cone crop, which is what these Clark's Nutcrackers need. And then the time between large cone crops has really been estimated about 3 to 5 years, so it's not something that happens every year, because it goes back to them. It takes 2 years to produce a cone. So the first year is pollination, and the second, so here's some whitebark pine seeds. So male cones develop the first year, and they are basically the start of what is required for the 2 years for cones to reach maturity. And so some of the things that we do here on the forest is we go out and we do cone surveys, and we look for things like, what does the pollen look like? What is, do you see see the first year conelets? So we're trying to gauge all of that with very limited resources. And you can see in this picture, the cones are really kind of encased in their needles. So it's really hard to see without having some type of overhead view. So we spend a lot of time climbing these trees, and then we'll get to the top, and it looked like there was a great cone crop, but we've already missed our opportunity because the Clark's Nutcracker have come in and already eaten the seeds. So it's kind of, the battle to get there first, for sure.
So that's the first year and second year cones on the same?
No, this is actually probably both second year. This is probably just off in the distance, so the scale in which that you're seeing
That actually is, that's all on the same page. So you got the first year cones on the tip, and then the second year cones, so they were on the tip last year.
Okay.
Yeah. And they've developed there, yeah. They grow rather quickly that second year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're bright purple. It's it's actually almost the color of your sweater there. So,
Tree climber took that.
Yeah.
From above.
So that's 2 years of cones.
Yeah.
Yep. And that does happen quite frequently. And I'm sorry I didn't take this picture, so I was assuming that was off in the distance. But yeah. Yeah, so really tight, compact seeds. They're really sappy.
So are you collecting seeds?
Yes.
You say, okay, because when you said the Clarks were getting them first, what you're doing is trying to collect seeds.
Yeah, we're trying to get there before they come. So what we'll do, and there's a, oh yeah, so here's a little bit. So I've got some pictures back in the couple later slides of how we go up and we do our cone surveys in May and early June. And then we cage them. So we'll cover them with a mesh cage to basically allow them to mature on the tree and, unfortunately, not provide food to the Clark's Nutcracker. But when we do this, we're not going after every single tree. I mean, we're looking at 10 to 15 trees in an area, and then we look at least 15 to 20 cages in one tree. So depending on, as you can see, I mean, there's cones all over this tree. So we might cage this and leave this open for them. So we do think about that.
Are you harvesting the seeds?
Yes.
And
Well, we send them off to our Forest Service nursery to have them extracted.
okay.
And then they're stored, and then we sow them. In fact, we collected last year in Chelan, and we're already sowing those seeds for outplanting. So,
How do you choose the trees that you collect from?
we look at factors like blister rust. We also look at mountain pine beetle. We look at just other than, like I said, the requirements and how many cages and stuff like that. Those are our biggest factors. So blister rust, because the idea is that we're trying to target these blister rust resistant trees, and we don't necessarily know that until we put them through genetic testing, and I've got some slides on that as well. So we look at indicators like, okay, this stand has white pine blister rust in there, but this tree's doing great and all the other trees around it have died. So that, in my opinion, sends up a red flag, not necessarily a red one, but a, hey, what's so individual, or what's unique about this tree that its brothers and sisters next door may not have. So then that's when we really get into the genetics of all these trees and the distributions and seed lots and seed sources and stuff like that. So, I mean, moving right into the threats to whitebark pine. I don't know if you guys are familiar with white pine blister rust, but it's orange cankers. You've got red flagging that comes up on the trees if there's blister rust on a branch. And what I mean by red flagging is not actually red flagging itself, but the branch will all of a sudden turn red, and it looks like they're holding out a red flag. So that's a good indicator for us. There's also cankers on the bole. So there's other factors with that as well. And then, so mountain pine beetle, I'm sure we're all familiar with mountain pine beetle. And it's outbreaks over the past several years, as well as some other threats or successional replacement due to fire suppression and shade-tolerant species coming in after and outcompeting, and then climate change.
Is there a particular age of trees that the blister rust is more apt to attack?
No, they'll pretty much go after anything. Yep.
Could you explain how climate change is a threat to whitebark pine?
So climate change, now you can look at it in different factors, whether it is affecting fire regimes and moisture, and so climate change, when we say this, it kind of is accelerating some things like insect outbreaks, as well as fire, altering fire regimes. So that's really where that comes into play. Climate change is also, they say that we're becoming hotter, warmer, drier. So what will that do to our high elevations that rely on our cold snowpacks and moisture and stuff? So we really don't know the extent to which climate change is actually affecting whitebark pine, but we know what it is affecting around it that has an influence on whitebark pine habitat and reproduction. So I kind of wanted to just briefly let you guys know about the ESA listing and some things that have recently come about. Just Christmas Eve, somebody was working and published the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lowered the priority rating for whitebark pine from a 2 to an 8. Now, I did some research and I can't really tell you what that truly means in regards to its status. As you can see above, we went to a whitebark pine conference in 2014, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was there, and they said they were going to revisit its listing in 2017. With the new recent changes in 2015, highlighted there in red, I don't know what that's going to do. So it's still a work in progress, it's still on people's radar, but they're saying that due to the beetle outbreaks subsiding and their cyclical events and how things, that it's not really affecting whitebark as much as it was previously. So it is still, here's a little bit. So listing number of 8 still means that there's an ongoing imminent and moderate magnitude of a threat. So there's still some things to be worked out, but in the long run, whitebark pine is warranted but precluded, which means there are other species in higher priority and funding. So it all boils down to dollars. So white pine blister rust is a non-native fungal pathogen that was introduced in the 1910s from Europe. It needs a secondary host, which is those ribes species, your gooseberries, your huckleberries, Indian paintbrush, things along that nature. And it can kill all size classes. So back to the... And then mountain pine beetle. So it's pretty sad to see the devastation that mountain pine beetle has had on whitebark pine and its habitat alone. We've collected from trees in 2008, 2009, and I've gone back last year and they're gone. They're standing snags. So it is definitely happening, as well as successional replacement. So this is a project that I'm working on right now, right on the Chelan Methow Valley District, Ranger District divide. That's North Navarre Peak off in the background. You've got Foggy Dew on the back side over here. And we're looking at doing some type of restoration thinning in there to release some of those whitebark pines from competition. So subalpine fir, lodgepole pine have basically outcompeted the whitebark pine. This area was burned in the 1970s, So you can see, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there's a little tiny white bark clump right in here. And these white bark and these subalpines are the same age. So you can see kind of the difference in how things grow. Obviously, subalpine is a faster growing species as well as lodgepole. So we want to try to keep some of our habitat dominated by whitebark pine, understanding that there is an intermixed zone of different species, and we're going to try to allow some of this regeneration to have some space to grow up and be our next cone producers. As I was saying, whitebark pine in different species, you know, this is once again in your guys' kind of area. So beautiful stands of trees, very unique habitats. It's one of my favorite tree species, one of my favorite ecosystems to work in. Unfortunately, we are not a forest that doesn't have fire, and I'm sure every one of you are aware. But whitebark pine and fire are not all bad. This was the 2004 Pot Peak fire in Chelan. So Lake Chelan is down here in the background, was what you're looking at, was over in the Met Howe. And I'll bring a good story to this here in a little bit. So, as going back to the climate change, our fire regimes are changing. We used to have low to moderate severity fires. Now we're having very large and high severity fires. That's due to fire and fuels buildups mostly from fire suppression, and also that the competing veg, so the shade tolerant species are flourishing rather than not. So, and I gave you guys a little bit of a tidbit of a paper to read on whitebark pine regeneration and fire. So the biggest thing that I pulled out of that paper was if there's a seed source nearby, the hope for regeneration is high, but if there is no seed source, and like Teresa was mentioning, you know, 20 miles, some of our fires are 150,000 acres, so 20 miles may be a different, you know, different state for that matter. So the key here is that if there's a seed source nearby, we can hope for regeneration. Now we do regeneration surveys, but sometimes we don't find anything, so then that's when we start to move into restoration planting. As I mentioned, the fire severity regimes have changed. We've gone from a low to a moderate severity to high. So whitebark pine was tolerant of low severity fires due to the characteristics listed above. And things are changing in that nature. This is Quartz Mountain in the Pasayten. We looked at planting there. We'll revisit that maybe soon. Stay tuned. So this is the one of many climate change models. And I just want to point out that models are models. They are useful tools to help build your toolbox of information. So you got current whitebark pine habitat on the left and predicted whitebark pine habitat based off the climate models. So this is the Met Howe Winthrop Chelan area. So we are considered to be the stronghold place for whitebark pine in the state of Washington. And you can see kind of the loss of habitat in Idaho and then the loss of habitat in Oregon, as well as Canada. So Canada has already listed whitebark pine is endangered. It was listed in 2010, and they're moving forward with full restoration strategies. So some things that we've done here on our forest, although very minimal, but very useful, and something that Teresa started and Connie's been a part of. We've installed 37 permanent plots across the forest. And this map's kind of small, but this covers, so what you see here in these are our conservation areas. And then, so we've got conservation areas across the whole entire forest, and they're each labeled, and then we've got permanent plots and surveys and cone collections and some thinning even up here in the Winthrop area. We've done things like verbenone flake tests to deal with, the mountain pine beetle epidemic.
What is that?
What's that?
What is the?
So the verbenone is an anti-aggregation, basically pheromone. It tricks the beetles into thinking that the tree is already fully occupied. So they'll just move on to the next one. So Connie did a lot of research on that. So we did an aerial application, actually, right here in the picture behind you is Brian's Butte. And so we did an aerial application of verbenone flakes, and then Connie hung traps and collected and gathered the intel from there. And then they've also done the pouch application, which is the pouches that you see on some of those trees.
So this is 2007.
Yeah, what's happened since then?
It's actually worked pretty great. We have seen good results. We did lose some of those trees, as you can see here in the background, but things have definitely kind of come to a lull in death by beetle.
It's a good question though, Peter, because obviously this is, if you're going to use an anti-aggregate to reduce bark beetle attacks, that happens every year. So you have to do it new every year. And the objective here was to try and save some of those high-value whitebark pines until the beetle outbreak subsided, which it kind of has now. And that's why the Fish and Wildlife Service has considered the risk to whitebark pines not as great as they were a few years ago, because the beetle outbreak through the range of whitebark pine has subsided. Now that could, that's cyclic. But right now we're in a lull.
But I do have a question on that, because it was 2011 when Fish and Wildlife Service determined that it rated listing. I mean, it merited listing.
Yeah.
You're not talking about that many years. When did the mountain pine beetle infestation subside? How did they measure it? And is it uniform, or did they look at it?
It's never going to be uniform, but they look at it across the range and say either the activity is really high and they're losing a lot of whitebark pines, or overall, over the range, it has subsided. And that appears to have happened. And we're seeing it here, and in the Rockies, it has also happened. So
okay, so it's in dispersed areas.
yeah, I think one thing that Eireann, you didn't mention is that as we have winters that are not so severe, mountain pine beetle can finish its life cycle better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the climate change.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we've had some of those warmer winters, and then we've had some colder ones, and so we're not in as high an activity of mountain pine beetle these last couple of years, but they look at this every year.
Yeah, but here until this year we've had warmer winters.
Yeah. But this
So
year's been
just
good.
this one year,
Yeah.
they're saying, that because of this one year,
They
they're
look
saying.
at it again, right.
Okay.
And they're still gonna reconsider, but what we wanna do is keep it off the list. Because once it gets on the list, we're much more limited in the things we can do. It's a question of whether we can collect cones, for instance, because then you need a tape permit for an endangered species. So what we wanna do is keep it high on the radar screen, but off the list.
How do you go about replanting a plot?
Replanting?
Yeah. Do you actually take the seedlings and start a plot somewhere?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you do it, and how many do you take with you?
So actually a group of us, just last year, there were 7 of us, Forest Service employees, and we planted 5,000 trees in just over 25 acres. So we did, the prescription that I wrote was for a clump gap pattern to mimic natural habitat, to where we would have clumps of even 3 trees in somewhat a foot radius, so they would grow up as a clump, and then 30 feet from there we would plant a single tree, and then 40, 50 feet from there we would plant another clump or a single tree. So it's all done by hand planting.
These plugs,
These were plugged.
you say grew in the nursery?
Yep. Yep.
And you don't have to cage them or anything like that?
Nope. We've had actually great survival with our planting. So I did my my bachelor's senior project on this, and I monitored our survival rates that we did in Chelan for planting, and we had 98 to 97% survival.
Wow.
So, if anything, we had more mechanical damage, which what I mean by that is if a snag fell on top of it, or a branch, or something got kicked on it, and that just required picking up the log and moving it, because the whitebark was still fine. It was just, it wouldn't have been fine if we wouldn't have gone back year after year, but it would have eventually, it would have perished.
And these were all trees that were thought to be blister rust resistant.
Yes, yes. So when we collect, so here's a comb collection from what we believe is a rust-free parent tree. So you can see the cages that we put on there. And then we take down notes on the characteristics of the tree. We can sometimes take a needle sample. We can do all sorts of things. But it really boils down to...
Is that Connie climbing that tree?
I think that's Sherry Farmer. So this is the testing for genetic resistance. So basically what Dorena does, Dorena's a Forest Service nursery and research center. Basically they take all that seed, they germinate it, and they put it in these boxes to basically say, okay, this family's resistant, or this family's resistant, that one's not going to do so well. So then they give us a rating, an A to F rating, basically, on our parent trees, and then that's where we want to basically target our comb collections. So right now we have several areas across the forest that have high ratings, whether they're an A or a B. And those are the areas that we're currently targeting for comb collections. So it's a very long process to see this. It takes about 5 to 7 years to get results. They're trying to expedite things so we can get some more results based off of our tests, our combs that we're sending in. So this was the image that I showed you earlier in regards to the 2004 Pop Peak fire, and I talked briefly about us planting. So we went and planted that area this year. It was under the Chelan, Methow, Tenasket, Whitebark Pine Reforestation Project. And you can see that we've got a cone seed source right here, and we were getting some natural regeneration, but it was very minimal. So if you think about this, it was 2004, this tree was only 12 inches, so it's slow growing. And then we came in and, like I mentioned, the single trees, or there was probably a clump right here, maybe 3 to 4 trees. And we're also looking at microsite locations, and we were briefly chatting in the break, is that the Clark's Nutcracker kind of builds this mental map in their mind based off of down logs and rock outcrops and things that they can remember, just like you and I would reference a certain location. So we try to mimic that as well, and that's why you see them being planted next to a log there. It also helps with the shade, the water, and all of those other microsite factors. This was the largest planting that we've done on the forest, actually that we've done in the region here so far, so that was pretty good to be a part of. There's other forests that are doing some more whitebark pine stuff. The Boise, this is my supervisor here who just came to our forest who did whitebark pine stuff, and they did a lot of thinning work. So releasing whitebark pine in these mixed species zones to help promote regeneration and reduce competition. So what can you do to help? I would just bring awareness to whitebark pine. This is kind of a slogan that's been spread far and wide now. This is what I hand out to, I work as a resource advisor with all of these fires. And so I'm working as a resource advisor. I'm thinking of all the other resources out there while they're still trying to control this fire. So this is the #1 tool that I give the firefighters that they understand. So we don't cut whitebark pines and we don't try to bulldoze through them. Now, it happens. I will not deny that. It's very unfortunate, but we do the best we can with the tools that we have to try to save this. So raising awareness to 18-year-old firefighters that are carrying drip torches and chainsaws out in the woods. This has been the best tool for us to to bring awareness to this species and its threats and high elevation. And do we need dozer lines at 10,000 feet? I don't know. So here's a couple references, resources that are great. The Whitebark Pine Communities book is back on the table. The Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation is a great resource. They, they've got cool swag now where you can get a Whitebark Pine shirt that helps with, funding some of these restoration projects. So they're a great resource. And I just want to special thanks to Connie, who has provided a lot of these pictures and has helped me, and then Teresa as well. So that's all I got.